January 1610. The English colony of Jamestown was supposed to be England's shining success in the New World. Instead, it had become a frozen hell where neighbors murdered neighbors for their next meal. Bodies lay scattered in the streets, too weak to bury their dead. The few survivors who could still walk were nothing more than living skeletons, their eyes hollow and desperate. The smell of death hung heavy in the air, mixed with something else, something that would make your stomach turn. It was the smell of cooking meat, but not the kind you'd expect. Because in the winter of 1609 to 1610, in what history would come to call the Starving Time, the English colonists of Jamestown did something that would haunt American history forever. They turned to cannibalism. This isn't some Hollywood horror story or urban legend. This is documented historical fact. The settlers of Jamestown, men, women, and children who had crossed an ocean dreaming of a better life, were driven to consume the flesh of their fellow colonists just to survive another day. Some dug up fresh corpses from the frozen ground. Others murdered their neighbors for a meal. One man even killed and ate his pregnant wife, salting her remains like preserved meat. How did it come to this? How did England's most ambitious colonial project descend into such unimaginable horror? The answer lies in a perfect storm of arrogance, incompetence, brutal weather, and the harsh reality that the New World was nothing like the paradise the Virginia Company had promised. In this video, we uncover the true story of Jamestown's darkest chapter, a winter so terrible that it nearly ended English colonization in America before it truly began. We'll explore how a group of English gentlemen, completely unprepared for frontier life, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. And we'll discover why this story, as horrific as it is, became the foundation upon which the United States would eventually be built. To understand how Jamestown became a cannibal colony, we need to go back to where it all began, in the counting houses and royal courts of England in the early 1600s. This was an age of exploration and expansion, when European powers were racing to carve up the New World for themselves. Spain had already struck it rich in South America, pulling mountains of silver and gold from places like Pocahontas. The Dutch were building their trading empire in Asia and the Caribbean. England, despite defeating the Spanish Armada in 1588, was still playing catch-up in the colonial game. Enter the Virginia Company of London, chartered by King James I in 1606. This was essentially a joint stock company. Think of it as the first corporate venture into American colonization. Wealthy investors pooled their money with dreams of massive returns. The company's propaganda painted Virginia as a land overflowing with gold, precious gems, and exotic goods just waiting to be harvested. They promised investors that colonists would quickly discover gold mines rivaling those of Peru, establish profitable trade routes with Asia, and convert the local indigenous peoples to Christianity and English commerce. The reality, of course, would prove to be devastatingly different. But in 1606, optimism ran high. The Virginia Company recruited about 144 men for their first expedition, though the exact number varies in historical accounts. These weren't hardened frontiersmen or experienced farmers. Many were gentlemen, members of England's upper classes who had never worked with their hands and considered manual labor beneath their station. Others were artisans, soldiers, and laborers, but almost none had experience with wilderness survival or establishing settlements from scratch. The expedition set sail from London in December 1606 aboard 3 ships: the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. After a grueling 4-month voyage that included stops in the Canary Islands and the West Indies, they finally reached the Chesapeake Bay in April 1607. Following the James River inland, they selected a site about 60 miles from the river's mouth and began building what they would name Jamestown, in honor of their king. The location seemed promising at first glance. The peninsula offered natural defenses against potential Spanish attacks, and the deep water allowed their ships to dock close to shore. But the site had fatal flaws that would soon become apparent. The land was swampy and prone to flooding, creating perfect breeding grounds for disease-carrying mosquitoes. The water was brackish and often contaminated. The soil was poor for agriculture. And perhaps most critically, the English had unwittingly established their colony in the middle of territory controlled by the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of indigenous tribes led by Chief Wahunsenkaw, known to the English as Chief Powhatan. From the very beginning, the colonists struggled with basic survival. They had arrived during the growing season, but wasted precious time searching for gold instead of planting crops. Many of the gentlemen refused to perform manual labor, believing it was beneath their dignity. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, and the colonists found themselves increasingly dependent on trade with local indigenous communities, trade that was often strained and sometimes violent. By January 1608, less than a year after their arrival, only 38 of the original colonists remained alive. Disease, starvation, and conflicts with indigenous peoples had claimed more than two-thirds of the settlers. It was a pattern that would repeat itself with devastating regularity over the next several years, as wave after wave of new colonists arrived only to meet similar fates. But this was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. Among the original Jamestown colonists was a man whose name would become legendary in American folklore: Captain John Smith. A soldier of fortune who had fought across Europe and been enslaved by the Ottoman Empire, Smith was one of the few colonists who understood what it would actually take to survive in this harsh new environment. Unlike many of his fellow colonists, he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, and he quickly emerged as a natural leader. Smith's most famous moment came in December 1607, when he was captured by Powhatan warriors while exploring the Chickahominy River. According to his later account, and this is where history blends with legend, he was brought before Chief Powhatan and sentenced to death. Just as warriors were about to bash in his skull with stone clubs, Pocahontas, the chief's young daughter, supposedly threw herself across Smith's body and begged her father to spare his life. Whether this dramatic rescue actually happened as Smith described is debated by historians. Some believe it was a ritualistic adoption ceremony that Smith misunderstood as a near execution. Others think Smith embellished or invented the story entirely to boost his reputation. But what isn't debated is that Smith was released and returned to Jamestown, where his relationship with the indigenous peoples became crucial to the colony's survival. Smith understood something that many of his fellow colonists refused to accept: they needed the indigenous peoples to survive. While other colonists dreamed of finding gold or waited for supply ships from England, Smith focused on establishing trade relationships, learning indigenous languages, and mapping the surrounding territory. His blunt motto became, "He who does not work, does not eat," a radical concept in a colony full of gentlemen who considered manual labor beneath them. Under Smith's practical leadership, the colony began to stabilize somewhat. He organized work details, enforced discipline, and successfully traded with various indigenous communities for corn, meat, and other necessities. He also led exploration missions that mapped much of the Chesapeake Bay region and established contact with numerous indigenous groups. His detailed accounts of these expeditions provide some of our best early descriptions of Native American life in the region. But Smith's leadership style was harsh and often brutal. He ruled with an iron fist, threatening colonists with violence if they didn't contribute to the colony's survival. He had little patience for the gentlemen who refused to work, famously declaring that the labors of 30 or 40 honest and industrious men were worth more than 1,000 of such as we have. This created significant tension within the colonial leadership. Then, in September 1609, disaster struck. Smith was severely injured in a gunpowder explosion that left him with terrible burns on his legs and lower body. The exact circumstances are unclear. Some accounts suggest it was an accident while cleaning his powder horn, while others hint it might have been sabotage by colonists who resented his authoritarian rule. Regardless of the cause, Smith's injuries were so severe that he was forced to return to England for medical treatment. Smith's departure marked the beginning of the end for Jamestown's brief period of relative stability. The man who had kept the colony alive through sheer force of will and practical leadership was gone, leaving behind a group of colonists who had grown dependent on his relationships with indigenous peoples and his ability to organize their survival efforts. The timing couldn't have been worse. Winter was approaching, supply ships from England were overdue, and tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy were rising. The colonists who remained were about to face a test that would push them to the absolute limits of human endurance and beyond. Without Smith's leadership and his established relationships with indigenous communities, the colonists found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. They had no idea that they were about to enter the darkest chapter in early American colonial history, the starving time. As autumn turned to winter in 1609, Everything that could go wrong for the Jamestown colonists did go wrong. It was as if fate had conspired to create the perfect conditions for disaster. The colonists found themselves facing not just one crisis, but multiple catastrophes that would combine into what historians now recognize as one of the most horrific episodes in American colonial history. First, there was the matter of leadership. With John Smith's forced departure, the colony lost its most effective leader. The man who replaced him, George Percy, was a gentleman and a capable administrator, but he lacked Smith's practical skills and his crucial relationships with indigenous peoples. Percy was the younger son of an English earl, more comfortable in London drawing rooms than in the harsh wilderness of Virginia. He would soon find himself completely overwhelmed by the challenges ahead. The leadership crisis deepened with the arrival of new colonists in the fall of 1609. A fleet of 9 ships had departed England earlier that year as part of the Third Supply, bringing hundreds of new settlers to bolster the colony. But the flagship, the Sea Venture, carrying the new colonial leadership, had been wrecked in a hurricane off Bermuda. The other ships arrived at Jamestown carrying their passengers, but without the strong leadership and most of the supplies the colony desperately needed. These new arrivals should have been a blessing, but instead they became a curse. The colony's population swelled to around 500 people, but food supplies remained critically low. The newcomers included more gentlemen who refused to work, as well as women and children who needed protection and care. Instead of strengthening the colony, the new arrivals simply meant more mouths to feed with resources that were already inadequate. Making matters worse, the colonists had failed to prepare adequately for winter. Smith's departure had disrupted the trading relationships that had previously provided crucial corn and meat from indigenous communities. The colonists had planted some crops, but their harvests were insufficient to feed the enlarged population through the winter months. Their livestock was limited, and they had failed to preserve adequate stores of food. Then came the decision that would seal their fate. As winter approached and food became scarce, some colonists decided to steal corn from indigenous communities. This wasn't trade or negotiation, it was outright theft. They raided indigenous food stores, taking winter supplies that indigenous families needed for their own survival. These raids destroyed the fragile relationships that Smith had carefully built over the previous 2 years. Chief Powhatan, who had previously been willing to trade with the English, now saw them as enemies. He ordered his warriors to surround Jamestown and cut off all trade. Any colonist who ventured outside the fort's walls risked death. The indigenous siege was incredibly effective. The English were trapped inside their own fortification, unable to hunt, fish, or forage for food. They couldn't even access the river to catch fish or harvest oysters that might have sustained them. The siege coincided with one of the harshest winters on record. Temperatures plummeted far below normal, and snow covered the ground for months. The James River froze solid, making it impossible to fish even if the colonists could reach the water. The cold was so severe that it killed whatever crops remained in their gardens and made it nearly impossible to venture outside for any extended period. Inside the fort, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The colonists had constructed their buildings hastily and poorly, with little regard for winter weather. The structures leaked and provided inadequate protection from the cold. Firewood became scarce as the colonists burned everything they could find to stay warm, including furniture, wooden tools, and even parts of their buildings. Disease began spreading through the weakened, malnourished population. Typhoid, dysentery, and other infections found easy victims among the starving colonists. Bodies began piling up faster than the survivors could bury them. The very young and the very old died first, but soon even the strongest colonists were succumbing to the combination of starvation, disease, and cold. By December 1609, the colonists were consuming their last reserves of grain. They had eaten their horses, dogs, and cats. They had boiled leather from their boots and belts to make a kind of soup. They had ground up their starch reserves used for laundry and tried to make bread from it. But still, it wasn't enough. As Christmas 1609 approached, the colonists of Jamestown faced a horrible realization. They were going to have to make choices that no civilized person should ever have to make. The line between survival and savagery was about to disappear entirely. The stage was set for the starving time, and the desperate measures that would follow would haunt American history forever. January 1610. Inside the walls of James Fort, humanity was unraveling thread by thread. The colonists had now been under siege for months, trapped by indigenous warriors outside and killing cold inside their inadequate shelters. What food remained could barely sustain a person for a few days, let alone the dozens who still clung to life. George Percy, the reluctant colonial leader, would later write in his account that the colonists were driven through unsufferable hunger to eat those things which nature most abhorred. This wasn't literary exaggeration. It was the careful documentation of atrocities that civilized people were never supposed to commit. It began with the recently dead. When colonists died of starvation or disease, their bodies no longer received proper Christian burials. Instead, desperate survivors dug up the corpses in the middle of the night and carved meat from the bones. They tried to cook the flesh to make it more palatable, but often they were so desperate that they consumed it partially raw. The smell of cooking human flesh began to permeate the fort, mixing with the stench of death and waste that already made the air almost unbreathable. But grave robbing was just the beginning. As the winter wore on and more colonists died, some survivors couldn't even wait for natural deaths. There are documented accounts of colonists murdering their fellow settlers for food. These weren't crimes of passion or sudden violence. They were calculated acts of predation. The strong preyed upon the weak, and the living fed upon the dead. The most horrific case involved a colonist whose name has been lost to history, though some sources suggest he may have been named Hugh Price. This man killed his pregnant wife and then proceeded to butcher her body like livestock. He salted portions of her flesh to preserve it, hiding the meat in his quarters while disposing of her head and other remains in an attempt to conceal his crime. When other colonists discovered what he had done, they were horrified, but by then, some had already crossed similar lines themselves. Percy documented another case where colonists murdered an indigenous person who had come to the fort, possibly under a flag of truce, and then consumed his flesh. They weren't content to simply kill. They treated human beings as nothing more than meat to feed their desperate hunger. Children weren't spared from these horrors. Some of the youngest colonists died of starvation, while others watched their parents descend into madness. There are accounts of children being murdered for their flesh, though the historical record is often vague about the most disturbing details. The survivors who later testified about these events were often reluctant to describe the full extent of what they had witnessed. The psychological impact of these acts was as devastating as the physical hunger. Colonists who had once been respectable English citizens, merchants, artisans, even gentlemen, found themselves committing acts that reduced them to something less than human. The social fabric that held their community together completely disintegrated. Trust disappeared entirely. Colonists locked themselves in their quarters, afraid to sleep because they might be murdered by their neighbors. Some colonists attempted to maintain their humanity despite the horrors around them. They formed small groups for mutual protection, sharing what meager resources they could find. A few refused to participate in cannibalism, choosing to die of starvation rather than consume human flesh. These individuals often became targets for those who had already crossed the line into savagery. The indigenous siege remained effective throughout the winter. Chief Powhatan's warriors maintained their positions around the fort, ensuring that no colonists could escape to hunt or forage. Occasionally, they would kill colonists who ventured too close to the walls, sometimes leaving the bodies where the other settlers could see them, a grim reminder of what awaited anyone who tried to break the siege. Inside the fort, the death toll mounted steadily. By February 1610, Percy estimated that only about 60 colonists remained alive out of the 500 who had been there when winter began. The dead weren't just victims of cannibalism. Most had died of starvation, disease, and cold. But the cannibalism had become so widespread that it affected everyone who survived, either as participants or witnesses. The survivors were barely recognizable as human beings. They had been reduced to living skeletons, their clothes hanging in rags, their eyes hollow and desperate. Many had lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Their teeth had loosened from malnutrition, and their hair had fallen out in clumps. Those who could still walk moved like ghosts through the fort, searching constantly for anything edible. Some colonists had begun eating materials that weren't even food: leather, starch, soap, anything that might provide a few calories to keep them alive another day. They scraped moss from buildings and tried to make soup from tree bark. They consumed their own bodily waste in desperate attempts to extract any remaining nutrition. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the The surviving colonists faced a terrifying realization. They were no longer the same people who had arrived in Virginia dreaming of gold and glory. They had become something else entirely, something that civilization should never have produced. The question that haunted those who retained any sanity was whether they could ever return to being human again. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. The worst winter in Jamestown's history was finally ending, but the consequences of what they had done would follow them for the rest of their lives. As the snow began to melt in March 1610, the true scope of the disaster at Jamestown became horrifyingly clear. Of the approximately 500 colonists who had been in the fort when winter began, only around 60 remained alive. Bodies lay scattered throughout the settlement, some partially consumed, others left to rot where they had fallen. The smell of death and human waste was overwhelming. The fort itself was in ruins, with buildings torn apart for firewood and the defensive walls deteriorating. George Percy, still clinging to his role as colonial leader, attempted to maintain some semblance of order among the survivors. But his authority was largely meaningless in a community that had descended so far into savagery. The surviving colonists were more concerned with finding their next meal than following orders from a leader who had proven incapable of preventing the catastrophe. Justice, when it came at all, was swift and brutal. The colonist who had murdered and eaten his pregnant wife was tried and executed, though by this point, many of his judges had committed similar acts themselves. The execution was less about moral justice and more about the survivors' desperate attempt to convince themselves that they still retained some humanity. Percy tried to document the horrors he had witnessed, knowing that he would need to provide an account to the Virginia Company when, and if, he ever returned to England. But even his careful record struggled to capture the full extent of what had happened. How do you describe in civilized language the complete breakdown of civilization itself? As spring progressed, the survivors faced a new crisis. They were too weak and few in number to plant crops or repair their settlement. Even if the indigenous siege were lifted, they lacked the strength to rebuild. Many were still dying from the lingering effects of malnutrition and disease. Others seemed to have lost the will to live entirely. Then, on May 23, 1610, a miracle appeared on the James River. Two ships, the Deliverance and the Patience, sailed into view. These vessels carried the survivors of the Sea Venture, the flagship that had been wrecked in Bermuda the previous year. Led by Sir Thomas Gates, the new colonial governor, and Sir George Somers, these men had spent months in Bermuda building new ships from the wreckage of their original vessel. Gates and his men expected to find a thriving colonial settlement. Instead, they encountered something that looked more like a charnel house. The emaciated survivors who stumbled out to greet them were barely recognizable as human beings. The smell alone was enough to make the newcomers retch. Gates later wrote that he had never seen such a sight in all his years of military service. The Bermuda survivors had brought some supplies, but not nearly enough to sustain the colony long term. Gates quickly assessed the situation and made a momentous decision. Jamestown would be abandoned. The surviving colonists would be evacuated, and England's first permanent settlement in North America would be left to rot in the Virginia wilderness. The evacuation began immediately. The survivors gathered what few possessions they still had and boarded the ships. Many were too weak to walk and had to be carried. As they prepared to depart, Gates ordered the settlement to be partially destroyed to prevent it from falling into indigenous hands. The fort that had been their prison for so many months was set ablaze. On June 7, 1610, the ships carrying the Jamestown survivors began their journey down the James River toward the Chesapeake Bay and the open ocean. For the colonists who had endured the starving time, it must have felt like being released from hell itself. They were finally free of the place where they had been forced to commit unthinkable acts just to survive. But their deliverance was short-lived. As the ships reached the mouth of the James River, they encountered another vessel sailing upstream, a ship carrying Lord de Lawar, the new colonial leader, along with 150 fresh colonists and substantial supplies. De Lawar had been sent by the Virginia Company to reinforce the colony, not to evacuate it. After consulting with Gates, De Lawar made a decision that would change American history. The colonists would return to Jamestown. The settlement would be rebuilt, not abandoned. This wasn't a popular decision among the survivors, many of whom never wanted to see Virginia again. But they had little choice in the matter. The ships turned around and sailed back up the James River. The survivors of the starving time would have to face their demons once again, returning to the place where they had lost their humanity in the struggle to survive. The return to Jamestown in June 1610 marked not just a geographical homecoming, but a psychological reckoning that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Lord de la Warr, arriving with fresh supplies and reinforcements, was appalled by what he found. Even after Gates had attempted to clean up the settlement, evidence of the winter's horrors was everywhere. De la Warr immediately implemented martial law, understanding that only the strictest discipline could prevent another descent into chaos. He established rigid work schedules, instituted harsh punishments for theft or laziness, and most importantly, rebuilt the colony's defenses and food stores. Unlike the previous leaders who had allowed gentlemen to avoid manual labor, de la Warr made it clear that everyone, regardless of social status, would contribute to the colony's survival. The new governor also took a harder line with indigenous peoples than John Smith had ever contemplated. Rather than seeking accommodation or trade relationships, de la Warr launched aggressive military campaigns against the Powhatan Confederacy. These weren't defensive actions. They were wars of conquest designed to seize territory and resources by force. The First Anglo-Powhatan War, as historians now call it, was brutal and devastating for both sides. English forces attacked indigenous villages, burned crops, and captured prisoners. Indigenous warriors retaliated with raids on English settlements and outposts. The relatively peaceful coexistence that had occasionally existed during Smith's leadership was replaced by open warfare that would continue for years. For the survivors of the starving time, this constant warfare was both traumatic and oddly liberating. After months of helpless victimization during the siege, they could finally fight back against those they blamed for their suffering. Many threw themselves into the military campaigns with an enthusiasm that concerned even de la Warr. The line between legitimate warfare and revenge killing often disappeared entirely. Meanwhile, word of Jamestown's disasters was filtering back to England. The Virginia Company faced a crisis of confidence among investors who had poured money into what they now realized was a failing enterprise. The company's propaganda had promised quick profits and easy colonization. Instead, they had produced one of the most horrific episodes in English colonial history. The company responded with a sophisticated cover-up campaign. Official reports minimized the extent of the cannibalism and starvation, instead emphasizing the colonists' heroic struggle against overwhelming odds. They promoted stories of noble sacrifice and Christian fortitude, carefully editing out the more disturbing details of what had actually happened. But the truth was harder to suppress than the company hoped. Returning colonists told their stories to friends and family. Ship captains spread accounts of what they had witnessed. Gradually, despite the company's efforts, the reality of the starving time became known throughout England. The scandal damaged the Virginia Company's reputation and made it much harder to recruit new colonists. To rebuild confidence, the company had to fundamentally change its approach to colonization. Instead of relying primarily on gentlemen adventurers seeking quick wealth, they began recruiting farmers, craftsmen, and other practical settlers. They also started sending women to the colony, recognizing that permanent settlement required families, not just individual fortune seekers. The introduction of tobacco cultivation around 1612 finally gave Jamestown the economic foundation it had always lacked. John Rolfe's successful experiments with tobacco varieties created a cash crop that could generate the profits investors had been seeking. Tobacco didn't grow like weeds the way Spanish gold seemed to flow from South America, but it provided a sustainable economic base for the colony. Yet even as Jamestown began to stabilize and eventually prosper, the psychological scars of the starving time never fully healed. The survivors carried the memories of what they had done and witnessed for the rest of their lives. Some left Virginia as soon as they could, returning to England to try to forget their experiences. Others stayed, but never spoke publicly about the winter of 1609 to 1610. The cannibalism became Jamestown's most closely guarded secret. Colonial leaders, church officials, and the Virginia Company all had compelling reasons to suppress the story. It contradicted everything they wanted people to believe about English civilization and Christian virtue. For generations, the full extent of what happened during the starving time remained largely hidden from public knowledge. This conspiracy of silence would persist for centuries, allowing mythology to replace history in popular understanding of early American colonization. The true story of Jamestown's cannibal winter remained buried for centuries, hidden beneath layers of sanitized history and patriotic mythology. The Virginia Company, colonial leaders, and later American historians all had reasons to suppress the most disturbing details of the starving time. Instead of confronting the horrific reality of what desperation had driven English colonists to do, they preferred to tell stories of noble struggle and Christian perseverance. This historical amnesia wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. The narrative of American colonization required heroes and villains, not complex human beings pushed beyond the limits of civilization. The story of brave English settlers overcoming indigenous resistance and harsh conditions served the needs of nation-building much better than accounts of cannibalism and moral collapse. But the cover-up began to crack in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as historians gained access to previously suppressed documents and archaeological evidence. George Percy's first-hand account, written shortly after the events, provided gruesome details that earlier historians had chosen to ignore or minimize. Archaeological excavations at the Jamestown site uncovered physical evidence of butchery and consumption of human remains, confirming the written accounts. In 2013, researchers at the Smithsonian made a particularly disturbing discovery. They found the skull and lower leg bone of a 14-year-old English girl, bearing clear evidence of cannibalization. The cut marks on the bones showed systematic butchery. Someone had carefully removed flesh from her skull and leg, suggesting not frenzied desperation, but methodical processing of human meat. The researchers named her Jane, and her remains provided undeniable physical proof of what the colonists had done to survive. Jane's bones told a story that no amount of historical revision could erase. She had arrived in Jamestown as part of the third supply in 1609, probably as a servant or the daughter of a colonial family. She had survived the ocean voyage and the initial challenges of colonial life, only to die during the starving time. But death hadn't ended her ordeal. Her body had been consumed by her fellow colonists. This archaeological evidence forced American historians to confront uncomfortable truths about the nation's origins. The story of Jamestown wasn't just about brave pioneers taming a wilderness. It was also about what happens when civilization collapses and human beings are reduced to their most basic survival instincts. Yet the horror of the starving time also illuminated something profound about human resilience and the foundations of American society. The colonists who survived this ordeal didn't just endure, they rebuilt. They took the lessons of their catastrophic failure and used them to create something more sustainable. The colony that emerged from the ashes of 1609 to 1610 was fundamentally different from the one that had nearly died. The post-starving time colonists abandoned the Virginia Company's fantasies about easy wealth and quick profits. Instead, they focused on practical concerns: growing food, building adequate shelter, and establishing sustainable relationships with their environment. They learned that survival in America required adaptation, hard work, and community cooperation, lessons that would become central to American identity. The experience also taught them about the importance of preparation and self-reliance. Never again would Jamestown colonists allow themselves to become so dependent on supply ships from England or trade with indigenous peoples. They built grain storage facilities, established backup food sources, and created contingency plans for emergencies. Perhaps most importantly, the starving time demonstrated that English colonial success in America wouldn't come through the transplantation of European social hierarchies and values. The gentlemen who had refused to work during the early years were either dead or had learned to contribute to the community as survival. The colony that survived was more egalitarian and practical than anything that existed in England. These hard-won lessons spread throughout English colonial America. Other settlements learned from Jamestown's mistakes, establishing more practical approaches to colonization from the beginning. The Plymouth colony, founded just 10 years after the starving time, benefited enormously from knowledge of what had gone wrong in Virginia. The psychological impact of the starving time also shaped American attitudes toward indigenous peoples for generations. The colonists who survived the siege carried lasting resentment toward the Powhatan Confederacy and indigenous peoples generally. This trauma contributed to the aggressive military campaigns and territorial expansion that would characterize English indigenous relations throughout the colonial period. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the starving time was what it revealed about the thin line between civilization and savagery. The colonists who committed acts of cannibalism weren't monsters. They were ordinary English people pushed to extraordinary extremes. Their story serves as a reminder that civilization is fragile and that moral constraints can disappear when survival is at stake. As we reach the end of this dark journey through Jamestown's most horrific winter, we're left with questions that extend far beyond colonial history. What does the starving time tell us about human nature? About the foundations of American society? About the price of survival and the meaning of civilization itself? The easy answer would be to dismiss the cannibalism as an aberration, a temporary madness brought on by extreme circumstances that has no relevance to our understanding of American history or human behavior. But that would be a mistake. The starving time wasn't an anomaly. It was a revelation of what lies beneath the surface of civilized society when all the normal constraints are stripped away. The colonists who resorted to cannibalism were evil people who had crossed the Atlantic with the intention of committing atrocities. They were ordinary English citizens, merchants who had invested their life savings in colonial ventures, artisans seeking better opportunities in a new world, gentlemen looking for adventure and profit, families dreaming of a better life for their children. In other words, they were people very much like us. What transformed them into cannibals wasn't inherent evil, but a combination of poor leadership, inadequate preparation, and circumstances that pushed them beyond the limits of human endurance. Remove the social structures, legal systems, and abundant resources that support modern civilization, and how different would our own behavior be? This uncomfortable truth helps explain why the story of the starving time was suppressed for so long. It's not just that cannibalism is disturbing. It's that it forces us to confront the fragility of the moral and social systems we take for granted. The colonists who ate human flesh to survive weren't monsters. They were us, stripped of everything that makes civilized life possible. But the starving time also demonstrates something remarkable about human resilience and adaptability. The same people who committed unspeakable acts during the winter of 1609 to 1610 went on to build a successful colony that would eventually become the foundation of the United States. They learned from their catastrophic failure and created something better and more sustainable. This paradox, that the darkest chapter in early American history also laid the groundwork for American success, reflects a broader truth about the colonial experience. The United States wasn't founded by perfect people who never made mistakes. It was built by flawed human beings who failed spectacularly, learned from their failures, and tried again with greater wisdom. The Virginia that emerged from the starving time was more practical, more egalitarian, and more adapted to American conditions than the fantasy colony the Virginia Company had originally envisioned. The colonists who survived had been forced to abandon European pretensions and social hierarchies in favor of cooperation and hard work. These adaptations would become defining characteristics of American society. The story also reveals the crucial role that indigenous peoples played in early American history, not as noble savages or evil antagonists, but as complex political actors pursuing their own interests. Chief Powhatan's siege of Jamestown wasn't random violence. It was a calculated response to English theft and aggression. The Powhatan Confederacy was defending its territory and resources against invaders who had repeatedly broken agreements and stolen food supplies. From the indigenous perspective, the English colonists were the aggressors. They had arrived uninvited, established a military outpost in Powhatan territory, and repeatedly taken what didn't belong to them. The siege was a legitimate act of self-defense, though its consequences proved devastating for both sides. Understanding this context doesn't diminish the horror of what happened during the starving time, but it does complicate the simple narratives that have dominated American historical consciousness. The colonists were innocent victims of indigenous cruelty. They were participants in a complex and often violent struggle for control of land and resources. The archaeological evidence that finally confirmed the extent of Jamestown's cannibalism also tells us something important about historical truth and the power of physical evidence. For centuries, historians had access to written accounts of the starving time, but many chose to minimize or ignore the most disturbing details. It took the discovery of Jane's bones, physical proof that couldn't be denied or explained away, to force a full reckoning with what had actually happened. This pattern of suppression and eventual revelation reflects broader challenges in how societies remember traumatic events. Every nation has dark chapters in its history that complicate official narratives and challenge comfortable myths. The question is whether we have the courage to confront these truths honestly, or whether we continue to prefer sanitized versions that make us feel better about ourselves. The story of the starving time also raises profound questions about the relationship between civilization and morality. The colonists who resorted to cannibalism hadn't lost their knowledge of Christian teaching or English law. They had simply reached a point where survival trumped moral constraints. This suggests that morality itself might be more dependent on circumstances than we like to admit. Yet the same story also demonstrates the power of moral regeneration. The colonists who survived the starving time didn't remain cannibals. They rebuilt their community on more sustainable foundations and eventually created a society that, while far from perfect, was capable of growth and moral development. This suggests that even the worst moral failures aren't necessarily permanent. Perhaps most importantly, the starving time forces us to confront the real costs of colonization and expansion. The English settlement of North America wasn't a bloodless process of brave pioneers taming empty wilderness. It was a violent, chaotic, and often brutal struggle that pushed human beings to their absolute limits. Understanding these costs doesn't invalidate the achievements that followed, but it does demand a more honest accounting of how those achievements were won. As we close this chapter of American history, it's worth reflecting on why the story of Jamestown's cannibal winter still matters more than 4 centuries later. In an age of global communication and abundant resources, it might be tempting to dismiss the starving time as an irrelevant historical curiosity, a horror story from a primitive past that has no bearing on our modern lives. But that would be a mistake. The fundamental challenges that faced the Jamestown colonists, leadership failures, resource scarcity, social breakdown, and moral crisis, remain painfully relevant in our own time. We've seen how quickly civilized societies can collapse when faced with natural disasters, economic crises, or political upheaval. The thin veneer of civilization that separates us from chaos is no thicker today than it was in 1609. The colonists who survived the starving time left us more than just a cautionary tale about the dangers of poor preparation and bad leadership. They also demonstrated the remarkable human capacity for resilience, adaptation, and moral recovery. The same people who committed unthinkable acts during their darkest winter went on to build something lasting and valuable. Their story reminds us that failure isn't final and that even the worst mistakes can become the foundation for future success. The archaeological discovery of Jane's remains in 2013 provided a fitting capstone to this long-suppressed story. Her bones offered undeniable proof of what had happened during the starving time, but they also served as a memorial to all the forgotten victims of early American colonization. Jane died as a teenager in a place far from home, her body consumed by desperate strangers. She deserved better than the fate she received, but her story has finally been told. The Virginia that emerged from the ashes of 1609 to 1610 became the birthplace of American democracy, the site of the first representative assembly in the New World, and the foundation upon which the United States would eventually be built. The path from cannibal colony to cradle of liberty was neither straight nor simple, but it demonstrates something profound about the American experience: the ability to learn from catastrophic failure and build something better on the ruins of what came before. Today, visitors to Colonial Williamsburg and Historic Jamestown can see reconstructions of the colonial settlement and learn about the early years of English colonization in Virginia. But most tourists never hear the full story of the starving time. The sanitized presentations focus on heroic struggles and eventual triumph, carefully editing out the most disturbing details of what actually happened during that terrible winter. Perhaps it's time for a more honest reckoning with this history. The story of Jamestown's cannibal winter doesn't diminish American achievements. It makes them more remarkable by showing how far the colonists had to travel from their lowest point to their greatest successes. It reminds us that the foundations of American civilization were laid not by perfect people, but by flawed human beings who learned from their mistakes and never gave up hope. The next time you hear someone speak confidently about human nature or the stability of civilized society, remember the winter of 1609 to 1610 in a small fort on the James River. Remember how quickly ordinary people can be pushed beyond the bounds of morality when survival is at stake. Remember also how those same people can rebuild, recover, and ultimately create something better than what they lost. The story of the Starving Time is America's story in microcosm, a tale of catastrophic failure followed by hard-won redemption, of moral collapse followed by patient reconstruction, of death and despair followed by new life and renewed hope. It's not a comfortable story, but it's a true one. And in the end, truth, however uncomfortable, is always more valuable than comfortable lies. The bones of Jane and her fellow victims rest now in museum collections and archaeological laboratories, silent witnesses to a winter when civilization failed and humanity survived. Their story reminds us that the price of our prosperity was paid not just in treasure and toil, but in blood and suffering that we're only now beginning to fully understand. The Starving Time was America's darkest winter, but it wasn't America's final winter. From that darkness came light. From that failure came success, and from that horror came hope. The colonists who survived learned that civilization is fragile, that morality is contingent, and that survival sometimes demands terrible choices. But they also learned that human beings are capable of rising from their lowest depths to achieve their highest aspirations. That, perhaps, is the most American lesson of all.